Hello, everyone. I'm just letting everyone filter in. I'm not going to sit in silence for very long, but I know that Zoom kind of lets people filter in a little bit slowly, probably so it doesn't break or collapse or something like that. Welcome to this kind of. I think this is our kind of first public expose of our psilocybin report. It's our kind of exclusive look, and we're really excited to show you ahead of publishing the report. Um, it's about psilocybin. What is psilocybin? We're going to get right into that. We've got two experts here with us, Gary and Brittany. And I think I'm going to just kind of dive in and start now because I think that number's stabilized and everyone's in, right? So welcome to Psilocybin Cannabis 2.0 or something new. I know that a lot of you on your invites will have seen CBD 2.0 or something new. That's because we're trying not to get put in your spam inbox for emailing you the word cannabis. Um, right, so I thought before we dive in, we could just give a little bit of an introduction about who we are before we get into the report and what it is. I think it's cool to talk about who's talking to you. So yeah, Gary, do you want to give us a brief introduction to who you are and why you're here?
Absolutely, Sal. Thank you. And hello, everybody. Good afternoon. My name is Gary Lewandowski. I'm the Senior Vice President of Strategy and Corporate Insights at Concentric Life. And I'm focused mostly on the commercial strategy, but also do brand strategy. I've spent over 20 years on client side with launching products in the pharmaceutical industry with a primary emphasis in the CNS and analgesic space. I've started a couple companies, a consulting company, as well as a wellness company, and that got me into the cannabis CBD arena, and now psychedelics. And so, very excited about today's topic and hearing from all of you and your perspectives and questions later on in the conversation. So, thank you for the opportunity today, Sal. Looking forward to this.
Oh, thank you so much, Gary. And I'm really excited. I mean, Gary and Brittany, I'm gonna just say they're two incredible experts and they've got some incredible stuff to tell you. So yeah, thank you so much. And Brittany, why don't you introduce yourself? Tell us a bit about yourself and why you're here.
Hi, my name is Brittany Fryman. I'm Gary's counterpart, the SVP Director of Social Media at Concentric Life. Been with Concentric Life for 6, 7 years, like too long that I've lost count kind of thing. But have a lot of experience in the social listening arena, been doing that for I think that entire time. So 6 years, been partners with Pulsar for the vast majority of that time and been very happy with the insights that we're able to garner for our clients. Really excited about this topic as an emerging therapeutic, what psilocybin can do for depression, anxiety, PTSD, and excited to share over a year of works that we've been working on here behind the scenes with you all today.
Yeah, this is a really exciting moment for us, and thank you, Brittany, because partnering with Concentric Life is a very important moment for Pulsar to be able to deliver this report. And Concentric Life is just such a great organization that is going to be their insights are very appreciated. So let's dive into this. So this is the data collection period of our search there. It actually has gone up. I just recently pushed it all the way up till February because it is. I thought it could do with a little bit of a revamp, so it's come all the way up till February. So we're going to be talking about psilocybin. So I'm sure Gary will talk us through a little bit about psilocybin in a minute. But I just wanted to talk to you about the fact that it's a burgeoning trend and the reason that we're looking at it. It's something that's really important to us at Pulsar. So for those of you who are coming from Concentric Life and aren't so familiar with Pulsar, Pulsar is a platform that can tell you absolutely every mention of, so say you're looking at psilocybin, we were able to look at every mention of psilocybin that's happened on socials, online news forums. It can also look at broadcast, podcasts, radio, anywhere that someone said psilocybin publicly, we can pick that up and analyze it in a bazillion different ways that you're going to see today. So Gary, why are we talking about psilocybin? What is so important about psilocybin and the conversation that's happening with it?
Thanks, Sal. I think in large part because mental health is a major issue in the United States today. There's a huge, large unmet need in the United States. It's estimated that 18% or close to 50 million US adults have a diagnosable mental disorder each year. And a lot of them are not being treated. And the ones that are being treated are not really happy with the results. There are side effects associated with the treatments, of course, but it's the efficacy and the benefits that those treatments are providing don't work for everybody. And so I think as people become disenchanted with the pharmaceutical product they've been using, although they're very good products, they also look for alternatives. And one of those alternatives are in the fray or in the fringe, if you will, of treatments that traditionally haven't been accepted by the medical establishment. And the category of psychedelics is one of those. And that includes things like psilocybin, but also includes ketamine. It includes MDMA. It includes DMT of ayahuasca. It includes a lot of different things. And so today we're talking specifically about psilocybin, but we also are talking about how this parallels with, cannabis or CBD, because cannabis and CBD are often incorporated into the banner of psychedelics, but in fact, it's not a psychedelic. And we'll talk a little bit what makes a psychedelic and what is psilocybin in a second. But I think it's this need for new treatments because of the great unmet need with mental health and the dissatisfaction with some of the available treatments that currently exist from the pharmaceutical side to date. So I think that's really why we're focusing in on it. And honestly, as we go through this report, you'll see that the conversations around psilocybin are very, very, very favorable. People are finding a lot of benefit with these products. Not to say that psilocybin doesn't have its dangers and warnings associated with it, but there is that subgroup of people that this really works well for them, Sal, and that's why we're talking about it today.
Thank you so much. I think it's really interesting to hear you talk about the kind of main use case that we're talking about with psilocybin today, which is that medicalization lens. Here we've got a wonderful quote from Dr. Joseph Sklar, also of Concentric Life, which I'm sure Gary can give us some more context on. But I just wanted to say that one of the lenses that we're looking at psilocybin through today and in this report is this kind of triad of legalization, medicalization, and recreation and wellness. And I wanted to situate those with you. So legalization is the talk that is just conversation that's just around the kind of regulation, legalization, Congress in different countries, different parliaments, and at what stages that is being pushed through. Medicalization doesn't look at the legal aspect of medicalization, but looks at the use case of medicalization. So that would be a use case for the specific mental illnesses that Gary mentioned and that we'll go into later, but also its kind of technical medical effects. And recreation and wellness goes into more of a outside of healthcare professionals into kind of more wellness space. So that's people using psilocybin for spiritual reasons, for fun, to enhance their perception of an event or a specific time or period, and for personal wellness reasons like retreats and things like that as well. Gary, do you want to just talk a little bit about this quote from Dr. Joseph Sklar and talk us through that a little bit more and situate us in this medical world?
Yeah, I love Joe. He always has great insight and true professional and very knowledgeable on a great number of topics, this one in particular. And I think his quote is very revealing because I think, if you talk to lay people about their perceptions on cannabis or cannabinoid therapies in general, a lot of them, will say something fairly favorable about them, but don't really have a lot of evidence to point to. Now, there is evidence that's been published in cannabis, and I think there's a lot of notion that it works very well for a number of factors, and we're going to talk about those a little bit later. But the reality is there hasn't been a lot of studies on cannabinoids. GW Therapeutics has done some stuff with CBD, and they have a FDA-approved prescription product. But it's this lack of data that brings skepticism to it. And so that's why this quote from Joe is so important, because it really talks about the studies and the research that's being done. There are numerous companies that are investing in the psychedelic space, and specifically psilocybin. And it's really the data that is going to demonstrate the legitimacy of this new therapeutic compound when it shows the efficacy and the safety around it. And not only that, it's also going to demonstrate the importance of the use of psychedelics, in this case psilocybin, with healthcare professionals, consulting them and giving them the types of guidance that they need for their treatments, and not just being left to their own guesswork in terms of going to, in this case of cannabis, going to a dispensary and purchasing a product and trying to figure out the dose and how to use it themselves. Instead, really working with healthcare professionals on the data that's been provided and how to apply these in their clinical practice and how to apply it towards treating their condition. I think that's the cornerstone of this. And that's why you see in the center here that this medicalization really spike, because there's been so much interest around it. The decriminalization that's happening around the country, it's a Schedule I product per DEA controlled substances, which essentially says it's got no medicinal value and thus it's illegal, similar to cannabis. But also similar to cannabis, people are claiming a lot of great benefits with psilocybin. And so the fact that these studies are being performed, the fact that people are finding value in it for their mental health, really is changing the dialogue across the globe, with a big emphasis in Australia, where it's been legalized recently, so that people actually have access to it and can be using it on a regular basis. So really, really interesting and perfect timing with the slide change, because here you can see that conversation and what the conversation is, where it's happening around the world.
Yeah, I thought because you mentioned Australia, I thought I'd give everyone a little visualizer here. So we're just kind of moving away from those lovely line shots that we've had, but we've also got something more pretty visualizations as well to show you. So I'm not going to dwell too much on every single slide, because we do have this report coming out, and if you want to see it in detail, and we're not going to be just reading from the screen from you here today. This is an exclusive look at the report, and please do keep an eye out in your inboxes for that report coming through soon. This is not where the conversation is taking place, though Pulsar can do that for you. This is the countries that people are talking about. So there is a North American focus here, and an Australian focus, as well as Germany. So these are unsurprisingly the areas that we are seeing regulation, medicalization changes happening with psilocybin. I want to then move on to psilocybin as a medical solution. So before, Gary, you mentioned about the use case of psilocybin. Here we can see an interesting use case for depression and anxiety, but also for PTSD, so a more maybe complex mental illness. Do you want to tell us a little bit about specifically the way that psilocybin can interact with people's brains for this use case?
Absolutely. So I think we have to step back for a second and ask ourselves, why are people so interested in psychedelics and psilocybin in particular? Like, why do they work? And when you answer that question and look to its mechanism of action, you recognize that psychedelics in total, which includes psilocybin, are really a class of substances that interact with the serotonin syndrome or serotonin system in the brain, specifically targeting serotonin receptors. So similar to the antidepressants that you're familiar with on the marketplace, they work on this neurotransmitter, and it's for that reason that they're able to augment and change your senses and really alter a person's thinking, their sense of time, their emotions. And at higher doses can have some of those effects that people look for recreationally, like changes in perception, with hallucinations and that sort of thing. So that's why they're known as psychedelics, incidentally. But at lower doses, and we'll get into this in a second, lower doses, you see less of the recreational effect of hallucinations and disorientation, and start to see treatment start to emerge. And here you're seeing the conversations around what people are using psilocybin for: depression, anxiety, PTSD. These are areas that traditionally have been very challenging to treat. The treatments that exist do have a lot of side effects associated with them, sometimes dependencies. And psilocybin is being used as an alternative here. And so here's a quote, someone has been using products for depression for years and have not been successful in it. And now they use psilocybin and they're seeing some success. So I think it's this kind of like firsthand experience and recognition that people are now seeing the light on a product that probably was not considered appropriate for medicinal use in the past, right? So I think everybody has a bias on them. I think this fact that, it's working in a way that prescription medications have been studied to work, but is an alternative way of working on that mechanism, really is exciting to people. And it's organic, that people feel that there's something natural about it. And that's why there's all this conversation for its use in these conditions.
That's really interesting. That's so interesting as well to think about the use of the drug, both as a hallucinogenic, but also, as you're saying, taking a smaller dose to be able to use the kind of benefits from this compound without a causing hallucinations, which I imagine if you have PTSD might not be the best best possible
Right.
outcome. So I want to acknowledge, right? So I am not a psilocybin expert. I'm a Pulsar and audience intelligence expert, but I'm not a psilocybin expert. But we do here have Brittany, who is is both of those things in one. So I come to this kind of search and this research that we did together was thinking, okay, psilocybin, magic mushrooms. This is what people take to get high. Thinking from a kind of just a layperson point of view, and would have expected on this chart on the right here to see macrodosing, which so the string for macrodosing included this search term isn't just macrodosing, but get high, get wasted, all those things. Kind of talking about the kind of more recreational use, I guess. But you expected something different, Brittany. Is that right?
I did. I actually expected to see microdosing. And what this did was validated my hypothesis. So we've been talking a lot about some high science stuff. And for those of you that are familiar with psilocybin, this feels very familiar to you, right? But for those of you that are social media managers and, psilocybin is outside your typical use case, let me just take it back for a second and talk to you about how I would approach this with clients. So we go into setting up our queries and we have some kind of idea of what we think the output will be, right? We have an idea of, I'm going to put these search terms in and I think the data will validate X, Y, or Z. I find it imperative to building a strong strategy to validate your hypothesis. And sometimes you validate it, and sometimes you find it's actually completely opposite, as in Sal's case, right? So when you are able to validate your hypothesis or any data, it actually helps build those stronger relationships with your clients. It builds a stronger strategy, and you have this, instant trust that you're able to build, because when data supports the strategy is just instantly stronger. So yes, I did expect to see microdosing come to the top. And what I think is really special about that is the conclusion that I would draw, because we have to make some inferences based on the data, right? Is that people are actually more interested in using this in a way that is regulated, that does seek medicalization and legalization, than in a way that is necessarily recreational. When you're talking about macro dosing, that's where you're talking about hallucinations and, like this transformative experience. But when you're talking about microdosing, that's really all about, the treatment of PTSD, even addiction to some degree, depression and anxiety. So there is a driving force for the people talking globally for things without a recreational use. People don't want to be tripping their brain serotonin receptors. They want to go in and find a way to use this as a therapeutic. And I think there's a huge barrier that you're going to face with patients, as well as what we call HCPs or healthcare professionals. And this would probably be a bigger barrier for healthcare professionals who think of psilocybin as a party drug, who think of it as something close to MDMA or LSD. But because there's so many therapeutic opportunities with this, we need to get past that barrier. And in common vernacular and language, what we're finding is that the patients, at least, are really past that. They are looking for this as a drug that is helpful for them, as a class of substances that can really help move their anxiety or their depression or their PTSD. And so I think that's a really positive direction to be taking it in. And I'm very excited and hope in a year, if we ran this exact same report, you would see that microdosing becomes even more of the conversation as opposed to less. And if you were to break this down even further, to look at how HCPs are talking about it versus patients, I'd like to see, that HCP area or the barrier be lessened as well.
Absolutely. And it's so interesting to think about this report over time. Obviously, as everyone watching will hopefully understand, there was so much in this search. We had nearly 14 million data points to analyze. So there's so much in this search that we can't show you. Because the report would be 200 pages long and you wouldn't read it. But we did see that earlier on in one of the earlier iterations of our report, as we've been making these visualizations, microdosing was a smaller section of that column here. And now, even just 6 months on, that microdosing has grown. I want to take you through this visualization next. So this is talking about the bodily effects of psilocybin. As we can see, there's a real focus here on the non-physical or like the non-bodily effects of psilocybin, just kind of grounding us in this validation of a theory that we would expect to see, but also bringing spiritual experiences as the top effect of psilocybin among audiences in this conversation. Really goes to show that people are speaking about this as a quite positive and life-changing medicine or experience. Coming on to that, we mentioned right at the top of the webinar, if you joined right at the top, that there was a lot of different ways that people are responding to psilocybin. So, you know, sometimes a controversial issue and something that people can have quite extreme opinions on, as we'll see when we get into the audience later. But I just wanted to kind of go into, I guess, this kind of speaks a little bit to what you're talking about with the healthcare professionals, Brittany, about overcoming that party stigma. And this really kind of shows that. This shows that there are a lot of emotions associated with psilocybin. We're not just talking here about feeling happy, feeling high, and high was within the search as well. Not one particular emotion or type of emotion, positive or negative, is standing out. I also wanted to point out the prevalence of Reddit in this psilocybin search. I think this is a good moment to talk about that. So we could see that Reddit was making up a large part of the conversation. And I mean, it's really interesting to see a quite often anonymized platform being used to talk about psilocybin in these areas where geographic areas where psilocybin is illegal. You know, maybe you can't be talking about this on LinkedIn, for example. You wouldn't want to be talking about that. Maybe you would. I mean, I've been talking about psilocybin on LinkedIn recently, so who knows? But yeah, I just wanted to showcase this. I think, Brittany, we covered the point about the healthcare professionals and moving away from a party drug. But when we get into this chart talking about psilocybin, this is the whole psilocybin conversation. Which other substances are mentioned in conjunction with psilocybin? So we can see here the two biggest ones are LSD and MDMA. So MDMA was legalized for prescription for treatment-resistant mental illnesses as well, alongside psilocybin in Australia. So that's potentially a reason why they're connected. But yeah, I think this is a really interesting place to talk about the kind of hurdle that healthcare providers do have, as well as the kind of connection with hallucinogens. Though what I do want to say before I kind of bring our experts back into this conversation is the lack of prevalence of cannabis here. So cannabis, CBD, and THC are used obviously very often in medical situations, much more than any of the other substances here. Obviously, opioids and benzodiazepines are medical, but when they're talked about in a kind of substance way, they're used for very different use cases. You know, no one's using psilocybin as a sedative, as far as I'm aware. So yeah, I think Gary, I was just wondering if you could tell us a little bit about kind of overcoming that hallucinogenic side too, you know, about the use of PTSD and things like that.
Absolutely. And I think it's not too much of a surprise to me that, you know, cannabinoids are not spoken as frequently with psilocybin as one might have hypothesized, because the experience is very, very different. And the use for those molecules are very different. I think that people use cannabis in a much different way for treating different types of areas of their life than psilocybin. And we have to go back to what Brittany was commenting on earlier about this conversation around macrodosing versus microdosing. I think that's a big driver to legitimizing psilocybin and changing the perception in healthcare providers' minds about its utility, because it's the macrodosing, the higher doses that generally are attributed to hallucinations and the negative effects, like, well, some of it might be a positive effect. The previous slide, I think, had someone talking about, puking rainbows and that sort of thing. And it was a horrible but amazing experience at the same time, right? That happens at higher doses. So when ingested, psilocybin is actually converted into another compound called psilocin. And psilocin actually is primarily responsible for the psychoactive effects. And if you think of it in the context of, what is macro versus microdosing, if you think of it like drinking a bottle of wine, if you have a glass of wine, you feel warm, you may feel the effects slightly, might feel a little good. If you have the entire bottle in a very short period of time, you might not feel so great, right? You might get nauseous and not able to speak clearly. But with a glass of wine, you can still speak clearly and still function. So there's a therapeutic range that's optimal that somebody wants to be in for the medicinal effect. And that's why it's being researched to identify what the dose is for that kind of effect. And there's studies right now, if you go to clinicaltrials.gov, there are trials in PTSD, substance use disorder, a lot of different areas, but they look at a range of dosing. Some patients are taking, 1 milligram, and others are taking a very high dose at 14 milligrams. I mean, it's a 14-fold change in the dosing, and they're trying to determine its effect, right? So these clinical studies, as they do this dose ranging or dose finding, they'll identify the more appropriate therapeutic range for the condition that they're using it for. And I think that's going to help healthcare professionals understand its effect and assure patients that they're not going to have a bad experience at the doses that they're recommending. And so I think that's the way to get at it, is understanding that the correct dose of psilocybin can have wonderful impact. I think that's the bet these companies are making anyhow. But at a higher dose, not surprisingly, you can have a really bad effect, or effect that you don't want medicinally, but suits you more on the recreational side. So
yeah, that's very interesting, isn't it? I think dosing is something that we have learned a lot about through this search that we didn't really know. That's actually coming up on the next slide. Before I move on to the next slide, Brittany, I was wondering if there's anything else you wanted to comment on this party side of things.
Yeah, it's not so much the party side of things. I guess party kind of comes into the fold, but
sure.
For me, as a strategist that's going to be looking at these sort of reports, and this again applies to any use case, I would set up this report to be looked at quarterly and over time, right? So we're seeing it now, but what does it look like in 3 to 4 months? And then again in 6 months? Because what you're hoping to do is put out messaging into the world if you're in advertising, right? So we write that strategy, we've put out content. Does the content in any way help shift any of these conversations? And I think that is a direct correlation in the success of a campaign or not. Now, sometimes it's very difficult in advertising to measure the success of your work. That's been something that the industry as a whole has been up against since inception. So anytime, once again, you can use data to validate what you're doing, that's a true success. So looking at these charts over time actually helps lead to changes in content, how you speak, where you speak, and who you're speaking to. So I think if you're looking at a strategy for building a great social listening deliverable for your clients, it's really all about having multiple touch points within the year to see how messaging should shift.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And I think the next slide kind of talks to the dosing and the looking at things over time. Just before we do that, I have noticed that one person popped their hand up just during that last little bit. If you have any questions whatsoever about this search, anything that you want to know about the kind of audience intelligence side of this, and just something that you wanted to share as well, do feel free to pop that in the Q&A section, which should be up somewhere on your screen, however you got your screen shared out, or pop it in the chat as well. I'll be able to see it there, and we'll be doing a Q&A at the end. Wonderful. I'm going to take us back into that kind of dosing and looking at things over time. So I thought that the previous slide, right, has the visualization that I think is the coolest, the prettiest, blah, blah, blah. But my favorite thing, one of my favorite things in the world is chocolate. And that's what this looks at. The chocolate is something that came out of nowhere for us to look at. I mean, this search has been going since July 2022. That's the date range that we're looking at. And as you can see on the right here, chocolate in terms of conversation with psilocybin is kind of skyrocketing. It's going up and up and up and up. And there's some kind of interesting theories about this. I mean, I think, Gary, you're ready to talk about the kind of reason that chocolate might be here. But then, I kind of also want to talk about the kind of over time effect as well. Before I just drag you into that, Gary, I want to say about the kind of derived products being very popular. It's something that we found. So Obviously, I think people associate psilocybin and the way that people take psilocybin with dried mushrooms, maybe brewed into a tea or a beverage of some kind, or kind of dried and eaten, and having a very specific kind of very earthy, natural taste. And we found that in this search, a lot of people talking about these more derived products. So we're looking at like gummies, edibles, chocolate, things like that. So Gary, first of all, why would people use chocolate with psilocybin? Like, what's the point? And why is chocolate maybe not the best thing to use with psilocybin?
Sure. Yeah, I think that you see, you look back at, how cannabis was first entered in the market. If you weren't smoking it and you decided to consume it, it was chocolate also was very popular. In fact, one of the big edibles manufacturers out in California got started in chocolate, and there's a reason for it. These earthy products have a very distinct flavor. It's very strong, very earthy, and sometimes really unpleasant taste if you're eating these little dry mushrooms. And apparently they don't chew very well, and they don't masticate very well as you're chewing them up. So instead they put them into chocolate. And there's a number of reasons. One, the chocolate helps with the palatability. It's enjoyable, right? Who doesn't like chocolate, right? But also the association that chocolate has with feel good. Right. Some people eat chocolate and they get a very pleasant CNS effect from chocolate, a mood altering effect with chocolate. So it helps with palatability. It helps with enhancing the mood. It helps with portability. I mean, a lot of this is probably recreational use in some cases. So, you don't know it's a mushroom. If someone were to look at your purse or your luggage or something like that, you just see a chocolate bar. So it's a way of hiding that you're using something that's a Schedule I controlled substance. And then probably more closer to the medicinal reasons, but variable, is dosing. If done correctly and you homogenize the amount of psilocybin throughout the chocolate bar and then have it broken up into even parts, you could approach effective dosing, right? Where each little part of the chocolate bar could be, say, 5 milligrams or 10 milligrams. So you can approximate the dosing of the psilocybin to control the effect that you have. So now as we shift from recreational use more to now legitimized medical use, you might still see a lot of chocolate consumption with psilocybin, but you might actually see more in like tinctures and capsules, because if you're taking a capsule, clearly you're not tasting anything. But that gives you more of a even better metered approach to dosing, so you have a control over that effect.
Definitely. I mean, we can see capsules here, which is the kind of most also rising on the right. And Brittany, you had a theory about why chocolate and why these derived substances are so popular. What's that?
Yeah, I think it's just harder to control, right? It's harder to maintain and control over time. And actually, when we get into our next slide, we're going to look at going down a rabbit hole. And that's our job as social media experts, especially in social listening. You want to just jump in, and it's about breaking down data in a different way, right? So we're going to start looking at, geographical locations. And what we'll find is that in Australia and New Zealand, where psilocybin and those psychedelic properties are legal, you're seeing less and less of a use for chocolate. So you're having more of a distribution, or the mechanism of distribution is basically more distinct in Australia to be things that are easier to distribute. So you have tinctures, capsules, and pills, and gummies. And I think that's very interesting because you're seeing the chocolate come out in places where you haven't seen that legalization happen yet, right? So, but it again is more difficult to regulate and maintain. Chocolate melts, for example. It just isn't. As much as we all love chocolate, it does have properties that aren't as easy to regulate. So, and Gary just talked about some of those. But going down rabbit holes is, one of the best parts of the job. And it's also, it can be tricky. You gotta go down, find all of the information, and then come back up. And so what does all of this mean? And when I look at that chart on the left, as we break down by geographical location, so you're looking at Australia and New Zealand at the top, and the US and the UK, what really just jumps out to me, once again, validating the same points that we talked about earlier, is that while recreation and wellness is a point of conversation, it is significantly smaller than the areas of legalization and medicalization combined, right? So people are truly interested in this as a healthy therapeutic. They want this to come to market in some way. And you're going to see less talk about recreational wellness in New Zealand because it's legalized. And as legalization rolls out globally, we do expect that shift to also occur in the US, UK, and frankly, another area we could have looked at is Canada, which is getting a ton of traction in this space as well. So expect recreation and wellness conversation to diminish as we see more conversations around legalization and medicalization jump up. And when that change occurs, I expect the MOD to also change and to see those charts on the right to again shift. So it's all about viewing this over time as the market changes. How is the conversation changing? And then how can that inform your briefs? How does that inform your creative strategy?
Definitely, and not to be kind of Pulsar adverty here, but the great thing about Pulsar is that if one country specifically makes a jump in regulation, or if something happens or something changes, like for example, Germany could well be here. You know, I mean, we've spoken a lot, you know, Brittany, about Berlin and how Berlin would look like on these charts. You can bring those in and kind of have this chart be every country of the world to kind of examine that if you'd like, which is very, again, one of those rabbit holes that would make this report 200 pages long.
Yes.
But yeah. And also, I wanted to say my personal reason that I don't think chocolate should be used in a kind of medical way is that it's too edible. I mean, I would just be eating the chocolate because I quite like chocolate, and then that would be very difficult. If I had a bar of chocolate in the kitchen, I'd be thinking about it right now. I want to take us very quickly through some of the top voices in the psilocybin conversation. So there's loads of ways of finding who the kind of top voices are, and I've kind of done 3 different ways of looking at it for you here. So there's kind of the amount of kind of content written. So this guy, a writer called Kyle Yeager, has written over 300 articles on psilocybin for quite well established places. And is kind of one of the main people talking about not just spreading news, but kind of doing opinion pieces as well on psilocybin. There's also, if we look on the right here, the Daily Shroom, which is an account on X, formerly known as Twitter, that has over 54,000 followers. So kind of audience size is something that we can look at as well. So this account mainly posts kind of like updates and news, but it also will do a little bit of memes or art or things like that. Now, the person in the middle I want to talk about the most. So this is the person who's one of the top voices by impressions. So this is just people kind of seeing what they've said. So Telrom_1, we have no idea who you are. Are you here? If you're here, make yourself known because we want to connect with you. Telrom talks, just an anonymous user on Reddit, talks about psilocybin in subreddits about psilocybin, but also subreddits, just random subreddits as well. Talking about psilocybin all the time. They're a big fan and they talk about it a lot. And so it's kind of interesting how you're able to find these kind of small people. So Telrom doesn't have a lot of, I mean, on Reddit, the follower system doesn't quite work like X or Instagram and TikTok and places like that. But Telrom has a huge influence over the psilocybin audience just by the amount of people that are seeing things. I think if you're someone who's looked up psilocybin already, you've probably seen something that Telrom said without even knowing it. So yeah, very interesting. I thought to just talk you through that. But let's have a look at the audience in general. So this is huge, and I know I always promise people to not just read from the PowerPoint. But this one, maybe I'll read a little bit from the PowerPoint because it's quite a complicated looking chart, and I want to make sure everyone understands. So this is using audience. So the bigger the node is, the more connected it is to the members of the audience analyzed, and the lines are showing the interconnectedness of the audience segments. So I hope that makes sense, and if not, I hope it looks really pretty and that you're enjoying looking at it. So these different segments of the audience, I wanted to show you a few more in depth, but before I do that, I just wanted to point out the amount of lines on this chart. We don't usually see a chart that has so much interconnectedness. This means that the psilocybin audience is talking to each other. They are kind of they're moving across these boundaries of their audience subsections. The only exception, or maybe exceptions really, is mushroom NFT creators. So these are people who are just kind of making their art based on psilocybin or making psychedelic art. They're kind of doing their own thing. And the cannabis community, who are a little bit more interconnected, but not crazy interconnected. You know, they're part of the cannabis community, but they're coming in and weighing in on psilocybin debates. And we'll be getting into that cannabis conversation shortly. We have a lot to say about these different sub audiences. Particularly, I want to talk about conservative conspiracy theorists. So these, when we looked at the post that these people were, I mean, conspiracy theorists, Brittany says that in every search you do, conspiracy theorists pop up, right? And we were really interested to see that it isn't just kind of negative or naysaying, but we've got a kind of really talking about psilocybin in conjunction with lots of other areas that we wouldn't usually expect. So we also see, I think I'll just draw your attention to the chart on the left here. So this in green, we've got the size of the audience. So that's how many people are in this sub audience. And in navy blue, we've got the amount of posts that they've done. So we can see here that psychedelic research advocates, even though they're a smaller audience, are making a lot of noise. And I think this goes back to something that we were talking about previously, Brittany, which is that it's not always quantity, it's a kind of quality, right? So this, if you looked at this in Pulsar, you'll be able to know maybe psychedelic research advocates are people we should be talking to, kind of reaching out to. But I know that you had a kind of something to say on the conspiracy theory side of things and the dangers of recreation. Yeah, do we want to jump into that?
100%. And this is just a talking point for, again, the social media strategists and analysts out there that are watching that are also running into conspiracy theorists in their searches and use cases. And that is, you know, we say this in advertising all the time, but quality over quantity. And you can see that the quality is much better coming out of these advocates than it is out of the conspiracy theorists because it's getting so many impressions and so much reach. But one of my favorite things about what Pulsar has added to their search just in the last couple of years is the ability to go from audience back to Pulsar and to validate the data. So if you are familiar with Pulsar at all, you know that you can look at the news, see if it's a verified news source, right? So is it fake news or is it actually real news? So taking this group of conversationalists back to Pulsar, validating whether it's fake news or real news will really help inform how and why you talk about things. You obviously don't want to base your strategies, especially in an emerging therapeutic space like this or any pharmaceutical space or healthcare space, based on fake news. You want to make sure it's, you know, you have grounding in that, it's based on science, and that your sources are solid.
Thank you so much. Sorry for the delay. I muted myself to have some water, and then I started speaking without unmuting myself. It's very interesting. I'm now we're kind of coming into the bit about cannabis. I'm really excited to show you these bits. This is kind of like a big boom. Is psilocybin cannabis 2.0? Is it something new? Yeah. So I'm gonna go into that, and I'm gonna acknowledging I can see people's questions rolling in. We will get time to have around a 10-minute Q&A at the end, so do keep sending those in. So this is our kind of cross analysis with CBD and THC. Gary, I was wondering if you could kind of situate psilocybin within the cannabis conversation and why people are comparing it and why they might be a little bit more nuanced to the conversation.
You know, cannabis 2.0 is a lot of people are saying that's what, you know, psilocybin is, and maybe even broader to psychedelics in general. And I think we have data from listening and the social experiment of listening to how people are talking about it to its actual use and application that suggests that won't be the case. You know, cannabis is widely spoken about. We know that THC in particular, as well as CBD more recently since legalization in 2018. But the conversation is really skewed towards medicalization around medical use of psilocybin versus those other two, because you know, cannabinoids can be grown in your own home if you so desire, and it's legal to do so. Or you can go down the street and purchase it at your local dispensary. Or you can go to your supermarket and get CBD there and utilize it. Where psilocybin still isn't going to be attained that way, right? In fact, psilocybin, along with other psychedelics, will have to be administered with a healthcare professional, usually with some guidance. Because the impact and the effect requires that. And so I think you'll see, and we'll talk about it in a little bit, but a completely different distribution model that really makes you think about the commercialization strategies that you'd want to deploy if you were going to get involved in this marketplace. You see CBD used a lot by people who don't want euphoria, and THC who want some of that euphoria or that effect. They'll use it for different use cases. Where psilocybin, it's not a different form of psilocybin, it's a different dose, right? So you get people who microdose for the more medicinal purposes and take higher doses for more of the recreational approach. So I think this is really interesting because the conversation around psilocybin, albeit the conversation is much less than what's being heard around CBD and THC, it's really dominated by the medicalization of it and the use for medical purposes.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's really interesting to see that the burgeoning psilocybin conversation is really centered around medicalization in a way that CBD and THC are not and never have been. Very, very interesting. Here we have something that I really can't wait to show you. So this is the medical issues that are associated with CBD and THC in this conversation. You can see we've got a lot of stuff here: pain, insomnia, and sleep disturbances, anxiety disorders. But then when we move into having psilocybin in there as well, we can see that it's depressive disorders is taking up a huge part of the conversation. So do you remember how small that line of that previous, in fact, if we go back, I can't go back. I don't know which key I pressed to go back. If you remember the line on the previous slide of psilocybin being a much smaller conversation than CBD and THC. However, in the medical conversation, psilocybin is really dominating it. And as we can see here, the psilocybin is not being used as much for these bodily insomnia and sleep disturbances and pain, but also for these maybe more complex mental health use cases such as OCD, ADHD, and PTSD as well. So these disorders that are much more complex to tackle. And Brittany, you said this shows something interesting about behavior.
Yeah, this really shows to me just like the breakout differences between CBD and psilocybin, and that psilocybin as a substance can actually help with more behavioral issues that people face. Whereas CBD, you're talking about, sleep, pain, you're rubbing on creams where you have muscle weakness or pain. To me, this is a completely different classification of ailments that you're treating. So you're really looking more at the behavioral side on a psilocybin treatment as opposed to physical or some of these like sleep issues.
Definitely.
Yeah, I agree. I think the way that people are talking about this, Sal, is just really indicative of how different these categories are, and how psilocybin is going to be really focusing in on substance use disorder, PTSD, like these mental health issues, and really cannabis, while there are exceptions, really focuses more on the wellness side of things and helping you with sleep. And of course, if you have some sort of severe condition that requires it, you might be using some prescription CBD, but for the most cases, you're really going to see the divergence in the two different substances, with really mental health issues going to psychedelics and everything else kind of falling into the cannabis.
That's really interesting. And so then we kind of get into thinking about the kind of commercialization, the kind of medical use case future, and the kind of psilocybin market, which is burgeoning and will undoubtedly be present. I mean, if everyone remembers back to before, even CBD was approved for regulated use. The concept of being able to go and buy a cannabis derived product from a high street shop felt bizarre. But I just wanted to kind of read out this quote from Elliot Lane, who's head of cannabis at Benzinga, which is a financial news website. So I wanted to kind of read it out in full. I keep telling you that I'm not going to read out from the PowerPoint, and then I do it anyway. But he says, there's some really interesting success happening with psilocybin in relation to addiction for gambling and addiction to alcohol. It's a reset. You see this in clinical use. I honestly think it's starting to take market share in the US away from ketamine for those who can do it. Psilocybin would be more of a tested, more of a proven FDA-centric medicine at that point, whereas ketamine companies are using loopholes similar to CBD and hemp. Now, I know we hadn't touched on ketamine at all, but it's another controlled substance that people are being that are used in clinical trials. However, I think it's very interesting that Elliot, who's an absolute expert in forecasting financial trends and writes about them for a living, is talking about how psilocybin will be used in kind of a different way to those loopholes. It's got kind of very deep medical backing. So what does that mean just in our last couple of minutes, I think, here before we move on to the Qs and the respective As that are coming afterwards? The future of psilocybin. So I'm going to kind of situate what this is before I kind of hand over to Gary for some final words on this slide. But we looked at the medical, illegal, and wellness obtaination methods of getting psilocybin. So the medical is kind of dispensaries, prescriptions from a doctor, that kind of thing. Dealer talks about kind of street dealers, online dealers, that kind of thing, and dark web dealers. And wellness talks about kind of retreats, psilocybin guided trips, kind of one-on-one, some shaman events that take place. And as we can see here, there is a huge focus on the medical. And if we see that over time as well, we can see that it's kind of growing over time as well in a lower level conversation, but nonetheless important. So Gary, I think this is a huge topic to hand over in the last couple of minutes as we get to the Q&A. But what's the future of psilocybin then?
Well, I think you really posed a really big comment there, Sal, and I think people aren't paying as close of attention to this industry as they need to. You heard it here first, if you haven't already heard it, is that the psychedelic industry really could revolutionize mental health care. I mean, compounds like psilocybin are rapidly being pushed through clinical trials. They're getting breakthrough designation status from FDA, and already they're being embraced by numerous cities and states across the United States for the medicinal benefits. And the psychedelic, commercialization process is going to closely mirror that of the pharmaceutical and the biotech industry, not the cannabis industry. And so working with folks that are experts in the cannabis industry is probably going to get you cannabis types results. If you want to see psilocybin and psychedelics do really well in the marketplace, you really want to align yourself and work with people that are very familiar with the pharmaceutical industry and have the experience of launching new products here, building markets, helping address some of the misconceptions around it. Because look, at the end of the day, the process is the process. The commercialization of psychedelics will start with, sizing the market opportunity. One data source suggests by 2027, psychedelics are going to hit $7 billion, which is small compared to $41 billion with cannabis, but these products haven't even been approved yet, and legalization is just starting to occur. So you're going to follow the market sizing opportunities. You're going to do competitive landscapes of the different molecules, including prescription medications. You're going to focus in on the product nuances and what makes them unique. You're going to be thinking about distribution and sales, marketing strategy, branding, social listening, like all these things that you would do in preparing a commercialization for a pharmaceutical brand, you're going to want to do with psychedelics to really take advantage of it. And I think that's the key here, is that these products are not cannabis 2.0. It's really pharma 2.0, if you will, and a more organic and green approach to it. So, my hope is that, and I'm sure as yours and Brittany, is that everyone on this call has gained some new insights and information on the use of psilocybin, the importance of them in the treatment of mental health, which is a large underserved population to date, and that to be successful, identifying partners that you can work with that understand how to create markets, build brands, and compete with the big boys in pharma are going to make your product successful, should you decide to go forward with those.
Wow, thank you so much, Gary. That's so incredible to hear you talk about this Pharma 2.0. That's kind of, wow, I wish I could give a full round of applause to you both for both of your input into both in creating this report and presenting it just now. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, does anyone have incredible anxiety when they're sharing their screen, no matter what it is, even though I know it's absolutely fine? So that anxiety is gone now. I'm going to move straight into the Q&A rather than kind of gushing with thanks for you two, so we can get as many questions in as possible. Please do pop your questions in even as we're going along, because we can direct these questions to be emailed back to you, so don't worry about it. I mean, maybe don't go asking me questions about like the kind of molecular science behind psilocybin, because I don't know. So it's not gonna, you're not going to be able to answer that. But I think this is kind of a good question for Brittany from Lauren. So why do big advertising agencies shun away from engaging these kind of clients that sell or produce these types of drugs? I think that's quite
it's a great question. And we started
yeah.
to tap on it a little bit throughout the presentation, but it's really that barrier, right? So people have these perceptions, if they're outliers, if they've never tried these compounds before, they don't understand them. And when there's a lack of understanding, there's trepidation when you're getting into that marketplace. So I think a lot of brands in particular, there are brands that are exploring this area and they are investing a ton. And Gary just talked about that. You know, they are a breakthrough exploratory therapeutic. We're seeing progress happen in Australia. But when it comes to specifically the US side, where you can have that direct to consumer or direct to patient kind of communication, you know, there's the barriers that HCPs face, their own perception of what these psychedelics can actually do. And so there's teaching that needs to be happening directly to the HCPs. There's also education to the patients that need to happen. Breaking down those barriers, increasing education on the unbranded side of things will really help, making sure that the type of information that is out in the ethos, right? It's that quality information, not the quantity. We want to make sure it's not stoner culture, and it's really about how we can move forward with better mental health opportunities. I hope I've answered your
that
question.
Was amazing. No, that's an amazing answer. Thank you. And if you wanted to look into stoner culture, that's something you'd use Pulsar to do as well. Yeah,
100%. 100%.
But I think with the psilocybin conversation, you're right. There is the more medical angle. I think it'll be more interesting for pharma brands to be going through this. Which I have a question here from Caesar, which I'll take, which is, do you know more about the audience's passion points behind these conversations, the types of music artists they listen to, political views, etc.? Yes, that's something that we can see. That's something that I don't have on the top of my head right now, because like I said, 3.7 million data points don't all exist in my head at once. But we do have that. It's really interesting. We can use Audience, which is a Pulsar kind of partner platform, to when we analyze that audience before, you can see kind of the associations that people have with in terms of the people they follow, the things that they talk about. However, there's also a new, very recent Pulsar feature called narratives. So this brings out narratives within the conversation. So if people were talking about, saying, psilocybin in relation to a particular artist, brand, area of politics or current affair, that would be picked up in that narratives and kind of being able to show that over time, how it evolves, as well as who's saying it, all this kind of thing. So I hope that answers your question, Caesar. Do get in touch if you have want any more info on that, or want any more info about this data set specifically. I'm going to direct this question at both of you, but maybe Gary first, just because I'd like to give you a question. How do you think brands can tap into the changing perspectives of psilocybin in the near future from a strategic angle, especially in regions where psilocybin is illegal? Also, do you see any successful brand stories in legal regions like the United States, Australia, things like that?
Yeah, so a really good question. So, I think it begins with, separating the conversation from a product and really talking about the issue, right? So rather than talk about the solution, talk about the problem that you're trying to address. And in those areas, I would talk about mental health and talk about particular areas that that are probably going to be aligned with your commercial intent. Let's pick on PTSD, for example. So if that's an area that that a company is going to be researching, investigating in, you obviously want to elevate the importance of that condition, the impact it has on people, the impact it has on budgets and the healthcare budget in total, and the underserved population. And there's a really strong story there that a lot of people are passionate about. It greatly affects veterans, for example, which people are hypersensitive to, and ensuring that they get care. So if you establish the unmet need and amplify that voice so that people are starting to pay attention, then the natural reaction is, yeah, darn it, why aren't we doing more? Why aren't there solutions? And then, because you establish that there are solutions, and you talk about the problem with the current products that are designed to help that patient with PTSD and the pitfalls around them, and then talk about these other alternative treatments that have some promising future. And then you pull that red thread further through by now communicating the benefits of different molecules. And you're doing all that building up to eventually what will focus in on your brand and what you end up launching. And it's not a short-term gig. This is something that you do by, in funding for many years, sometimes depending on the complexity of the market and the issue. And with something like psilocybin, where there is, trepidation because of its association with recreational use, because it is illegal as a Schedule I product, it probably requires more groundwork to do that. So that's where I would start. A lot more to talk about on that topic, and happy to offline if you're interested. The last part of your question, I believe, was around examples in the legal areas of products that have accomplished that. And I don't have a good example for you off the top of my head. I haven't gone in deep into the Australian market, New Zealand markets to look at that. But I think what you're going to find, if I were a guessing person, and I am, is that it's highly fragmented with no real dominant player. Much in this case, I will use cannabis as an example. I mean, there are thousands of brands in cannabis. How many can you name? Right. And so I think the reality is it's the same thing there. It's very fragmented. There aren't big players. Maybe in local markets, everyone knows one or two. But really overall, there's no dominant player yet. And you're starting to see consolidation happening in the cannabis space where, 3 years ago, there were 5,000 companies out there, hawking CBD. Now we're down to 3,000. And the big names like Charlotte's Web eventually are getting prominence. But even still, when you do market research, they have a very low percent of unaided awareness overall. So I think that's maybe an example of what's happening with the psilocybin space now. But over time, particularly as these products get approved, you're going to see that change. And when those products align with agencies that understand how to make big brands and how to communicate to the targeted audience in an effective way, that's really the game changer.
I think, and I know we're close to time. I'd like to add on to that just for a quick second.
Please.
So the regulatory environment in the United States, UK, and Australia is also very different. So when you're talking about success stories of brands, you have to understand that in Australia, we can't talk to patients directly, right? So it's all about moving the needle for healthcare professionals. We need to talk directly to the healthcare professionals in order to remove that stigma. And the fact that in Australia, we've already seen, legalization, a lot of that stigma has already been removed, or companies are working fast to remove that stigma, going directly to those healthcare professionals. But when it comes to the United States, it's very different, even than our counterpart here, Sal, who's in the UK. There's no direct to patient communication in the UK. Here in the United States, we can go direct to patient. So it's going to be moving the needle on the consumer landscape. What you're seeing has already happened, and our data today did validate that people are interested in legalization, about doing this correctly, about doing it in a way that feels like it's medically, positive, way to do it. But I think Gary said you have to work with partners that understand those spaces and the nuance of those spaces, and that's a big example there.
Thank you so much, both of you. I think we've got more questions, but I am aware that we've gone over time. 2/3 of people have still stuck around to this point. Hello, thank you so much for sticking around, and I hope that I'm not running into your next meeting. But I think just for this, I feel like it would be unprofessional to keep everyone in over an hour, because we've got a good few questions, but they've got names attached that I can reach out. But I think they're really interesting. I mean, I don't know. Post in the chat. Should we post in the chat? Do you want us to carry on? I mean, Brittany and Gary, would you like to answer a couple more questions? Or
sure, yeah, love to.
Sure, amazing.
We might have to do another one of these very soon, Sal. Who knows?
I would love to. In fact, I think I'll ask one more question just to kind of wrap up, and then we can say our goodbyes. But I will say to Erin and Sam, I will chat to you, and that the answer in a short is yes, and I will give you a longer answer types. And we have a question here coming from an anonymous attendee. So I wanted to ask that, because I won't be able to shout out to you directly. Anyone who's put their name, I will reach out to you directly. Given the sensitive nature of the topic, do you encounter any barriers when collecting this data? Considering health sensitive data has been neglected in certain regions, it's likely it could be subject to bias. Could you talk a bit about how you navigate through these barriers?
I can definitely at least start on this one, if that's okay.
Yeah, it's a bit of a long one, isn't it?
Yeah, so this is, we talk about the roles of social media managers. They're diverse. And for any of those of you that are on this call, we know that social listening is just one area that you can be an expert in, right? There are other areas like community management, that one-to-one communication that happens between brands and the people behind the scenes, the consumer or customer or patient, and the people that are sitting back behind the scenes answering those questions. So we get this question a lot in community management, which is why I was excited to jump in. When we're talking about pharmaceutical brands, there are things we refer to as AEs, or adverse events. So if somebody has a not positive experience with a treatment of any type, and they go on social media or anywhere and they report that, it has to be reported internally. There is a very specific and strategic process that has to be followed. When you're doing social listening for pharmaceutical brands, every brand has a different set of standards, all of which fall under, or should fall under, FDA and FTC compliance, right? So I highly, highly encourage you, or whatever other regulatory, based on where you're located globally, just make sure that you understand the compliance regulations of those regions. Follow them. I just want to reiterate, don't walk outside of the lines when you're talking about pharmaceutical brands, but you want to report those AEs and make sure that you are sending through to the proper channels and following those compliance regulations. So yes, we have to think about that. When we report out on things, we like to remove the people that are saying the things, right? There are HIPAA laws that we have to be very aware of here in the United States. And I'm sure globally that those are different per country, but also very similar. Patient information is utmost importance, and we don't want to be sharing anything that is sensitive, even if people are publicly posting it themselves. If all of a sudden I say I have an eczema rash all over my hand, publicly, that's my knowledge to share, but it's not a brand's knowledge to then share elsewhere, right? So make sure you understand the rules and regulations of your markets.
That is a great sentiment to end on. Thank you so much. And just thank you both as well for giving your insights today, and for helping me talk through this very, very complex subject that I'm not an expert in, and that you are. So yeah, incredible. For anyone who wants the recording of this, it will be available and sent to you, and the reports will also be sent to you within hopefully a day. That is dropping the mic. Yeah, I think, who was it recently who Millie Bobby Brown refused to reveal any information about Stranger Things, and I'm not going to do that. It killed the vibes. I'm not going to kill the vibes of the report. Amazing. Thank you so much. If you have any questions, if you're thinking about this and the rest of your day, feel free to email them through to us here at Pulsar, and we can pass them on to Brittany and Gary, or you can reach out to them directly. Everyone's available and findable through Pulsar's LinkedIn and socials and things like that. So yeah, thank you again, both of you. And yeah, can't wait to share this report with the world. Thank you.
Thank you all so much.
Have a great day. Bye.
Bye.